There are things that people carry so long they stop describing them as things they are carrying and start describing them as simply the shape of themselves. Not a wound, though it was a wound once, but the scar that the wound left, which is not the wound, but is also not the absence of the wound. It is the specific, settled, permanent shape of something that happened, and that changed the architecture, and that you have lived inside for long enough that you have stopped distinguishing between the original architecture and the modified one, because you have never known anything else. This is a story about a man named Calvin who had been carrying something since he was 9 years old, not as a wound exactly, but as the shape his life had taken after the wound, which was the shape of a man who had a twin brother who disappeared when they were 9 years old, and who had spent the 30 years since trying not to think about it in a way that required him to think about it constantly. About the search that had run underground in Calvin for 3 decades, quiet, persistent, the kind of looking that happened in the back of the mind, even when the front of the mind was living the life that was available to be lived. And about what happened on a Family Feud stage on a Wednesday afternoon when Steve Harvey stopped the game in the second round and looked at Calvin and said, "Before we continue, there is something you need to know," and about the door at the back of the stage that opened, and about what walked through it, and about Steve Harvey, who had known for 16 minutes, 16 specific minutes from the moment the production assistant had put the note in his hand to the moment he stopped the game, what was about to happen, and who had spent those 16 minutes in the specific full weight. What do I do with this 16 minutes quality of a man who understood that he was in the presence of something that did not happen and that was happening, and who was going to handle it correctly or nothing else about the afternoon mattered? He handled it correctly. This is how. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because this channel is here for exactly these stories, for the doors that open at the back of the stage, and we come back with one every single week. Now let us talk about Calvin. Calvin Moore was 39 years old and had been born in Cincinnati, Ohio on March 14, 1985, the older of twin boys by 7 minutes. His brother Devin born third and quietest, and the one who their mother said was the thinker, the one who processed before he spoke, the one who at 9 years old had been put into the child welfare system when their mother's situation had become what it had become, and when the system had done what the system sometimes did, which was to separate the twins, not because separation was the policy, because the placement that was available for Calvin was not available for Devin, and because another placement had been found for Devin in a different county, and because the caseworker had believed, or had believed she believed, that the separation was temporary and that the system would find a way to reunify them. The system had not found a way. Calvin had gone to his foster family in Cincinnati. Devin had gone to his placement in a different county. The temporary had become the permanent in the specific, accumulated. No one intended this way that temporaries became permanents when no one had the time or the resources to make them temporary again. Calvin had been 9 years old and had been placed and had stayed placed and had tried for the first 2 years to find Devin through the system and had been told by a series of caseworkers, some of them sympathetic and some of them not, that Devin was in a placement and was okay, and that the reunification process was ongoing, and that he should focus on his current placement. And then, when he was 18, he could pursue the matter through the appropriate channels. He had pursued it through the appropriate channels when he was 18, and at 20, and at 24, and at 29 when he had hired a private investigator who had found a trail that went cold in a foster care system that had been imperfect in its documentation. He had never stopped. He had carried it in the specific, quiet, underground way, not as the defining thing of every day, but as the thing that was always present, the way a sound you have stopped consciously hearing is still being heard by the part of your brain that does not stop hearing things. He had a life. He had a good life. He was a plumber in Cincinnati who had been in the trade for 15 years and who had built a business with 3 employees and a reputation in the neighborhoods he worked that was built on the specific, pointed at evidence of someone who showed up when he said he would, and who did the work at the standard the work deserved, and who charged what the work was worth. He had a wife, Tamara, 37, who had married him 6 years ago knowing about Devin because Calvin had told her about Devin on their second date because Calvin did not begin anything important without saying the true thing first, and who had been beside him through 2 more rounds of looking since they had been together. He had a daughter, Layla, 4, who was not at the taping because she was 4. He had a life. He also had the shape. Tamara Moore was at the podium. She had the warm, direct, entirely present quality of a woman who had been beside Calvin for 6 years, and who had been beside the shape of Calvin, who had understood the shape, and who had not required him to have a different shape, and who had loved the shape as the shape of the person she had married, which was the actual complete form of love rather than the idealized version. She was warm and direct with the physical therapist's comprehensive, ground level, what is actually here intelligence. She was a physical therapist in Cincinnati and had been for 11 years, and the work had given her the specific quality of someone who had been reading what bodies could and couldn't do for 11 years, and who brought this reading to every room she entered. Calvin's aunt, Shirley, 62, had been the family member who had fought hardest for reunification when Calvin was 9, and who had been told for 30 years that the system was working on it, and who had the specific 30 years of fighting the system quality of someone who had been told this enough times to know what it meant, which was sometimes it was true, and sometimes it was not, and you could not tell which was which until you were on the other side of the time and could see what had happened. And Calvin's friend of 20 years, Marcus, 40, a contractor who had known Calvin since they were both teenagers in the Cincinnati trade apprenticeship programs, and who had the specific 20-year, I know this person quality of someone who had been present through the looking and who understood what the looking had cost. The application had been submitted by Tamara, who had submitted it because she had thought Calvin deserved an afternoon organized around who Calvin was, the business, the 3 employees, the reputation. And because she had thought, in the specific long shot, maybe this is how things work way that the partners of people who carry long searches sometimes thought, that a large audience and a television show was one of the available ways to keep a name and a face in circulation. She had not anticipated what was going to happen. She had submitted the application with the straightforward, let us celebrate my husband quality and with the small, quiet, you never know secondary hope, and then she had written Devin's name in the special circumstances section of the application because the section asked and she had answered. The production team had seen the name, had run it, had found something. Had found, after 3 days of running it through the resources available to a television production company that had been doing this for 30 years and that had a great many resources, a man named Devin Moore who was 39 years old and who was living in Columbus, Ohio, 90 miles from Cincinnati, and who had his own version of the underground search. They had called Devin. Devin had said before anything else, "Is this about Calvin?" He had said yes before the sentence was finished. He had driven to the studio that morning. He had been in a green room for 2 hours. He did not know if this was real. The production assistant had put the note in Steve Harvey's hand 16 minutes into the second round. The opposing family was the Jenkins family from Dayton, warm, competitive, excellent, and going to have the specific experience of playing Family Feud in the same room as something that was going to be in their memory for a very long time. The pregame. Steve Harvey moved through both families with the customary warmth and arrived at Calvin with the genuine, curious attention he brought to people who had something real to say. He asked about the plumbing business. Calvin described it with the warm, direct, organized quality he brought to everything. 15 years in the trade, 3 employees, show up when you say you will, do the work right, charge what it's worth. Steve Harvey asked, "Where did you learn that?" Calvin said, "My aunt." He said it in the warm, direct voice. He said, "She was the person who made sure I had what I needed after I went into care. She taught me that the showing up is the whole thing." He said it in the plain, this is simply true voice. Steve Harvey received it. He asked about the showing up. Calvin said, "When I was 9, I was placed in foster care." He said it plainly, without embellishment, because it was simply the fact. He said, "My aunt showed up. Every week for the 9 years I was in care, she showed up. That is how I learned that showing up was the whole thing." Steve Harvey said, "And now you show up for your customers." Calvin said, "And for my employees," he said, "and for my family." He said it in the complete, this is the account voice. Steve Harvey asked if there was anything else about the placement he wanted to say. He said it gently, following the thread, in the careful voice he used when he was following something that had more in it. Calvin looked at him for a moment. He said, "I had a twin brother." He said, "We were separated when we were placed." He said, "I have been looking for him for 30 years. He said it in the flat, reporting, this is simply what is true voice, not performing the carrying, not inviting sympathy, just saying the accurate thing in the plain, direct way he said everything. Steve Harvey said, 30 years. Calvin said, yes. He said, "I have not stopped looking." He said, "I do not expect to stop looking." He said it in the organized, this is the plan voice of someone who had made peace with the looking being indefinite and who had not made peace with stopping. Steve Harvey said, "I hope you find him." He said it with the warm, genuine quality of a man who meant what he said and who did not say what he did not mean. He moved on. He had the note in his pocket. He had been given it 6 minutes before the game began. He had been carrying it for those 6 minutes with the specific, full weight. What is the right moment quality of a man who had been given something that was going to change the afternoon and who was going to handle the changing correctly? The game began. The first round was competitive and warm. Calvin played with the organized, practical, I show up and do the work quality applied to survey questions with the direct, accurate, nothing wasted competence of someone who had been doing the work correctly for 15 years and who did not make things more complicated than they needed to be. Tamara was warm and precise. Shirley had the 30 years of fighting the system quality applied to survey questions with the specific. I know what people actually do when the system is involved intelligence of someone who had been watching what people actually did for a long time. Marcus was direct and warm and right. Second round. Midway through. Steve Harvey received a question from the board, looked at it, and did not ask it. He said, I need to stop the game for a moment. He said it in the quiet, deliberate, I have something to do voice. He looked at Calvin. He said, Calvin, before we continue, there is something you need to know. He said it in the specific, careful, I am going to say this correctly voice of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds were going to be the most important 30 seconds he had managed in a very long time, and who was going to manage them correctly. He said, when Tamara submitted your family's application, she mentioned your brother in the special circumstances section. He said, the production team did some searching. He said, they found something. He paused. He said, I want to ask you something before we continue. Are you okay? Are you ready to receive whatever this is? Calvin was very still. He was in the specific. The looking has been going on so long that the possibility of it ending is itself a kind of arrival quality of a man who had been carrying a search for 30 years and who was now in a room where someone had just said, they found something. He said, yes. He said it in the quiet, this is what I have been waiting for voice. He said, yes. Steve Harvey looked at the door at the back of the stage. He said quietly, okay. He said it in the organizing, this is what happens now voice. He said, Devin. The door at the back of the stage opened. A man walked through it who was 39 years old and who was, in the specific, complete, unmistakable way that twins sometimes were even after 30 years apart, Calvin. Not exactly Calvin. The 30 years had made their own marks on each of them. And the marks were different because the lives had been different. And the lives had been different because the placement had been different. And the placement had been different because the system had done what the system had done when they were 9. But the height and the eyes, and something in the way he moved that was the specific, physical. This is where we came from quality that twins sometimes shared, even when they did not know they were sharing it. He was wearing a green shirt and he had the organized, steady, this is real and I am in it quality of a man who had been in a green room for 2 hours and who had done the processing there and who was now done processing and who was simply here. Calvin said his name. He said it in the voice that was not any of the voices he had been using all afternoon. The private voice. The 9-year-old voice, the voice from before the placement. Devin said his name, same voice, same source. Steve Harvey had moved to the side of the stage. He was at the edge of what was happening. He was going to let it be what it was. He understood that his job in this moment was the room, holding the room, keeping the room, making sure the room was large enough and still enough for what was in it. He was doing that job. He was doing it by being entirely present and entirely not in the way. The two men met in the center of the stage, not at the podium. In the center where the host stood, except the host was at the edge and the center belonged to them. They stood for a moment in the specific, full, I have been looking for you for 30 years quality of people who had found each other and who were, in the finding, also in the full weight of everything the 30 years had been and everything the 30 years had cost, and everything the 30 years had produced in each of them separately that was now going to be in the same room for the first time since they were 9 years old. They embraced. It was not a television embrace. It was the specific, full body. This is real embrace of two men who had been 9 years old the last time they were in the same room and who were 39 now, and who had found each other in the middle of a game show on a Wednesday afternoon because a woman named Tamara had written a name in a special circumstances box. The studio was completely still, not the various stillnesses of any other afternoon. This one. The specific, gathered, unanimous, breath held, 300 people and everyone's stillness of a room that is in the presence of something it understands is real, and that is choosing, without being asked, to be still for it. The Jenkins family across the stage had the full, attentive, warm. There are no words quality of 5 people who had come to play a game show and who were watching something that was not a game show and who understood the difference and who were glad to be in the room. The production team had the full, professional, we have seen a great many things quality of people who had seen a great many things and who had not seen this. Shirley, at the podium, was not maintaining anything. She had been fighting for this for 30 years, and she was in the room where 30 years of fighting had produced a result, and she was in it with everything she had and everything she did not have left. Marcus was standing beside her with the warm, full, "This is my friend" quality of a man who had known someone for 20 years and who was watching the most important thing that had ever happened to that person happen in real time in front of him. Tamara was looking at the center of the stage with the warm, full, "I submitted the application not knowing, and this is what happened" expression of a woman who had written a name in a box, and who was in the room where the name had become a person. Steve Harvey let the moment be the moment. He stood at the edge, and he held the room, and he let the moment be the moment for as long as the moment needed to be itself. When it was ready, which was not a timed thing and was not a scheduled thing, but was simply the quality of the room having received what it needed to receive, he walked to the center. He said, "I'm going to say something, and then I am not going to say anything else for a while because nothing I could say is going to be as important as what just happened, and I know that." He said it in the quiet, organized, I have found the words voice. He said, "A woman submitted a Family Feud application for her husband's family. In the special circumstances section, she wrote one name. The production team found that name. They made a call. The person said yes before the sentence was finished." He said it in the flat, factual, this is the account voice. He said, 30 years. He said it simply. He said, 30 years of a man looking and a system failing and a search running underground, and a name in a box and 3 days of searching by a production team, and a man in a green room who said yes before the sentence was finished. He said, that is what happened today. He said, in this room. He looked at Calvin and Devin. He looked at Tamara. He looked at Shirley. He looked at the room. He said the room was large enough. He said it in the quiet, final, this is what I want this room to know voice. The room found them. The room was large enough. He said, we are going to take whatever time is needed, and then if everyone wants to, we are going to finish this game. He looked at Calvin. Calvin said, we want to finish the game. He said it in the warm, direct, forward-moving, this is what we do next voice. He said, Devin. He said his brother's name. He said, you want to play? Devin said, I drove 90 miles for this. I'm going to play. The room laughed with the full, warm, released, thank you for giving us permission laugh of a room that had been in something very large and that had been given by a man who had been looking for his twin for 30 years. The permission to exhale and laugh and be glad and be in the next thing, which was the game, and the game was the right next thing. Steve Harvey said, Devin Moore, you are on the team. He said it in the warm, official, this is happening now voice. He looked at the Jenkins family. He said, I want to thank the Jenkins family for the grace and the patience they have shown in this room. Diane Jenkins, the family's team captain, said, there is nowhere else any of us would rather have been. She said it with the specific, warm, entirely genuine quality of someone who meant it completely and who had not prepared the sentence. Steve Harvey received it. He said, let's play Family Feud. The game resumed, and what the game became was the game of 6 people playing together, 5 Moors and 1 Moor who had not known he was on the team when he arrived, and who was finding out that he was good at it, in the specific, direct, organized way of a man who had been running his own accounting firm in Columbus for 8 years, and who brought to survey questions the direct, numbers and people accuracy of someone who had been reading what clients needed and what the numbers said for a long time. He was right at a high rate. He had Calvin's quality, the show up and do it right quality in a different form, applied to different work, producing the same underlying result. Calvin, beside him for the first time in 30 years, played with the warm, organized. The team is complete now quality of a man who was in the game and who was also in the specific interior. I have found my brother quality of a man who had found his brother and who was playing the game beside him, and who was in the warm, present, entirely unmanaged way exactly here. The Moors won the main game. They won it with 6 people and 30 years and a name in a box and a production team that had spent 3 days searching and a man who had said yes before the sentence was finished. Fast money. Calvin said, Devin goes first. He said it in the warm, direct, no discussion voice. He said, he drove 90 miles. Devin said, I was going to say the same about you. Calvin said, you drove further. Devin said, by 20 minutes. Calvin said, 20 minutes is 20 minutes. He said it in the warm, slightly wry, this is how we are going to be voice. The voice of a dynamic arriving in real time, the specific, oblique, finding out who we are to each other quality of twins who had been separated for 30 years and who were in this small exchange, beginning. Tamara had the warm, I am watching this happen, and this is everything expression of a woman who had written a name in a box and who was watching the name become a dynamic. Steve Harvey said, Devin goes first. Devin walked to the fast money podium. He walked to it with the organized, direct, I drove 90 miles, and I am ready quality of a man who had been in a green room for 2 hours and who had been processing for 30 years, and who had arrived at this podium in the specific ready, let's go quality of someone who had been prepared by a very long preparation. Steve Harvey looked at him from across the stage. He said, "Devin Moore. You were 9 years old the last time you were in the same room as your brother. You are 39 now." He said it in the plain, full account voice. 90 miles, 30 years, a name in a box. He looked at Devin. He said, "Tell the survey what you know." Devin said, "Start the clock." He hit the button. Devin Moore answered 5 Family Feud survey questions in 20 seconds with the organized, direct, people and numbers accuracy of an accountant who had been reading what situations required for 8 years, and who had spent 30 years reading the specific, underground. This is what looking costs, and I am going to do it anyway way of finding something. He was right. 3 of his answers were number 1. 2 were not. He received the 2 that were not with the same equanimity as the 3 that were, which was Calvin's quality applied in Devin's form, which was one of the many things the afternoon had been producing in the form of evidence that the 30 years had changed them, but had not changed the source. Calvin scored 97 points in the second seat with the direct, organized, I show up and do the work quality applied to survey questions with the warm, right at a high rate accuracy of a man who had been looking for 30 years and who had found what he was looking for and whose hands were therefore entirely free for the game. Combined total, 269 points, $20,000. Steve Harvey brought the check. He brought it to Calvin and Devin together, and he stood in front of both of them, and he held the check between them, and he said, 30 years, one name in a box, a production team who spent 3 days searching, a man in a green room who said yes before the sentence was finished. He said, $20,000. He said, I do not know what you do with $20,000 after 30 years. He said, but I know that whatever you do with it, you do it in the same room now. He held the check between them. That is what matters, he said. The room was large enough. Calvin took the check. He held it. He looked at his brother. Devin was looking at him. They were in the specific, full, just beginning quality of 2 people who had found each other and who had 30 years of being found to do and who were at the beginning of the beginning. Calvin said, we are going to need a bigger room than this. He said it with the warm, wry, forward-looking quality that was starting to emerge as the quality that was specifically his and specifically Devin's together, which was not yet a defined quality but was becoming one. Devin said, 90 miles is not so far. Calvin said, no. He said, it is not so far. Steve Harvey looked at them. He said, it is not so far. He said it in the quiet final, this is the last word on this voice. He said, 90 miles. And now it is not so far at all. The episode aired 7 weeks later, after careful coordination with both Calvin and Devin, and after both had reviewed the cut, and after the production team had done the work that the work required. The clip spread in the immediate, wide, quiet way of things that named something that a very large number of people had been adjacent to. The specific, pointed at, this is what the foster care system did to families' experience of people who had been inside the system, or who had family who had been inside the system, and who had watched the specific, documented. This is what happened to us result of the system's failures. The clip spread among foster care advocates, and among adoption advocates, and among people who were looking for someone, and who had been looking for a long time, and who watched a man find his brother in the middle of a game show, and who were, in the watching, reminded that finding was possible, and that possible was not the same as inevitable, but was also not nothing. Several organizations that worked on sibling reunification in the foster care system used the clip in their materials. Several said, this is what the work is for. The second thing that spread was Tamara, the woman who had written the name in the box, the simple act of answering a question honestly in a form that most people treated as a formality. Several people wrote about it. She wrote the name in the box because the section asked and she answered. Several said they had not known that forms had sections like that, or had not thought to take those sections seriously, or had dismissed the special circumstances as not special enough. Several said, I have a name. I'm going to write it down. Several people who were looking for someone or who had family who was looking for someone wrote that they were going to write the name in every box that offered the space. Several said, you never know which box is the right box. Devin had his own story of the 30 years. He had been placed in Hamilton County, had aged out of care at 18, had tried the appropriate channels at 19 and at 22 and at 27. He had hired the same kind of investigator Calvin had hired, a different firm, a different cold trail. He had had the same underground search, quiet, persistent, always running. He had moved to Columbus 8 years ago for a job and had established his accounting firm and had a life that was a good life, and that had the shape that Calvin's had, which was the shape of a person who had a twin brother somewhere and who had been looking for 30 years. He said, when the production company called and said, "Is this about Calvin?" I thought I was having a dream. He said, I sat down on the floor in my office. He said, my assistant came in and found me on the floor. He said, I had to explain it to her. He said, she cried. He said, I drove to the studio before I had finished explaining. They meet every other Sunday now, sometimes in Cincinnati, sometimes in Columbus. They are finding out who they are to each other, not who they were to each other at 9, which is also there and which arrives in the small, specific. This is familiar ways that it arrived on the stage in the calibration of the exchange. But who they are to each other now at 39, after 30 years of separately becoming who they are. They are finding it out. Layla, who is 4, has met her uncle. She said after the first meeting, the specific 4-year-old's matter of fact, this is a fact assessment, he looks like Daddy. She said, is he Daddy? Tamara said, no, he is Uncle Devin. He is Daddy's brother. Layla said, oh, she said, does he have a daughter? Tamara said, not yet. Layla said he should get one. It is very fun. Calvin, who had been listening from the kitchen, came into the room and looked at his daughter and looked at Tamara with the warm, full, this is what 30 years produced expression. He said, I agree with Layla. Tamara said, of course you do. She said it with the warm, this is simply who we are expression. She said, go call your brother. He did. He does. 90 miles, not so far. There are things people carry so long they stop describing them as things they are carrying. Calvin stopped carrying it on a Wednesday afternoon when a door at the back of a stage opened and the shape of his life changed from the shape of the man who had a twin brother somewhere to the shape of the man who knew where his twin brother was, which was 90 miles away, which was not so far at all. The room was large enough. The name was in the box. The production team spent 3 days. Devin said yes before the sentence was finished. He drove 90 miles. It was not so far. It has never been so far. The room found them. The room was large enough. If this story reached you, if you have a name you have been carrying or a name you could write in a box, share this today. Write the name. Leave a comment below and tell us what you're carrying from this story, because this community carries things together and your voice here matters. And subscribe right now if you are not already with us, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the names in boxes. Stories about the doors at the back of the stage. And stories about the man who had been looking for 30 years and who found his brother 90 miles away on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of a game show and who said, 90 miles is not so far, and who was right, and who calls every other Sunday, and who is right every other Sunday too. We will see you in the next one.